Hi, I'm Nunn, and in this video I'm going to talk about a recent book from Gambit Publications, Magnus Carlsen's Most Instructive Games. As the title suggests, the author, Martin Kravtsev, has chosen games which he feels can teach you quite a lot, and I certainly learnt a great deal from playing over these games. I'd seen some of them before, but Kravtsev gives a kind of new perspective on them with his notes, and in particular, he chooses in each game what he calls a Magnus moment, which is a point at which Magnus finds a move that other players might very well have missed, and explains the logic behind these moves. And it's certainly true that Carlsen, while he might seem to have a very classical style, nevertheless has these particular strengths which come into play at certain points in the game. I've chosen one game for the book. I can't go through it in huge detail, but I just want to emphasise two particular moments which could easily both have been Magnus moments, where Carlsen found a move which was not easy to see. I'm using Gambit's app, Chess Studio, to play over the game. So let's go through the opening. It's a Sicilian Defense, Time Arnold variation. Of course, there are many moves for white here. White can play bishop e2 or bishop e3, but g3 is also not a bad move, and in fact I played it myself when I was an active participant in Grandmaster tournaments, with, I must say, fairly mixed results. Anyhow, this is all normal stuff. And these days, one of the most popular lines for black is to exchange on d4 and then play bishop c5, and there's a lot of theory on that. It's perhaps black's most solid option. But in this game, black, rapport, played a kind of Scheveningen style move, just bringing his pawns abreast, d6 and e6. This exchange is the sort of thing you don't often do in the Sicilian because it strengthens black's pawn centre, but in this particular variation with the bishop on g2 is actually quite a good line. The knight goes to a4 to make way for the pawn to advance to c4, and the plan is to play c4, b3, bishop b2 with a kind of Maroczy bind grip on the centre. In this case, black's three pawns abreast, while quite solid, tend to lose some of their dynamic possibilities. So black now played a slight inaccuracy. He shouldn't commit himself to a move like rook b8 straight away. Rook b8 might be a useful move, but at the moment it's not clear whether that's the case, and therefore a more flexible move, such as simply developing the bishop to e7, would have been a better choice. One point is that white very often puts his bishop on b2 and not e3, and then covering the b6 square with the rook is completely redundant, because the bishop on b2 isn't pointing at the queen side at all. Therefore, rook b8 might, and in fact does, turn out to be a loss of time. White continues with the strategy I outlined, and black pushes his c-pawn, opening up a diagonal for the bishop from b7. Good move. And development by both sides continues. I'm not going to details about the notes. Kravtsev makes convincing the case here that white should probably have played f4, but he didn't. He played instead, he played his queen to e1. And the idea here is he wants to create a space for the rook to go to d1, and at the same time gaining time through the threat of pushing the pawn to e5. Well, actually black could have simply played bishop d7, and then the plan doesn't work too well. But black missed this possibility and decided to play safe, dropping his knight back so as to counter white's threat to advance his e-pawn. It's again a bit of a loss of time. White now develops his queen's rook. As you can see, with the bishop on b7, the rook on b8 isn't really doing anything, which emphasises that playing this move earlier was actually a loss of tempo. White's last move lines up queen and bishop with the rather direct threat of mate on g7. But the aim here is after black blocks it and white drops back with his queen, black can't exchange bishops. White would take back with the knight and then black would have no way to defend the weak pawn on d6. So black is pretty much forced to drop the bishop back, and the upshot is that white has transferred his queen from e1 to the more active square d2 with gain of tempo. Well, white actually repeated the moves here to gain a bit of time on the clock, and now started with the characteristic advance of the f-pawn, playing for an attack to control e5 and increases central control generally. Black's somewhat lacking in active possibilities here. He's got this d-pawn he has to worry about the whole time. With the bishop on g2 and the pawns on c4 and e4, there's no real chance to push through d5, so black has to be content with fairly passive play. He actually played e5, which is actually not a bad move. It blocks the diagonal of the bishop. And white now came up with a good idea. The bishop's diagonal, as I say, is blocked and is unlikely to become open unless black voluntarily exchanges on f4. So the bishop now goes to a5, where it controls some important squares like c7 and d8. Let's just see how that plays out. The bishop can't easily be dislodged. Black can't move the bishop back to d8 because his d-pawn's hanging, and there's no real possibility of transferring the knight to c6 in this position. So this bishop remains a bit of a thorn in black's flesh. Well, up to here, black has made this slight inaccuracy in the opening, but otherwise he hasn't done anything wrong. But now he makes a move which I think is inconsistent. He played earlier to block the diagonal from a1 to h8 with this pawn, and now he should have been content with passive defence, maintaining this strong point on e5 and keeping the position as closed as possible. This exchange actually gives white extra dynamic possibilities, which Carlsen soon puts to good use. Now, this is a critical moment, and indeed this is the author's Magnus moment. White has a nice position. White has a space advantage and a good centre. Black has a backward pawn on a half-open file and not very many active possibilities. Although there is a chance that the pawn on e4 could become weak later. Black's already got two attackers, and the rook and potentially the knight could come to attack it as well. So it would probably be unwise for white to hang around too much. There's always a temptation when you have a clear position advantage to just play some kind of quiet move like king h1 or something like that, or maybe knight d5, just maintaining some kind of advantage. But one of Carlsen's strengths is his willingness to transform the position, to give up one advantage to get another advantage. And amongst the world champions, I would say that Bobby Fischer also had this particular strength of not being content just to sit on an advantage, but be willing to increase it by transforming it into an advantage of a different type. And here, Magnus pushes forward in the centre, and in fact this move is a pawn sacrifice. So he's committing his central pawns. It's a very committal move indeed, but he has judged absolutely correctly, and the computer certainly backs him up on this, that the breaking open of the centre and the gaining of dynamic possibilities for white is well worth the sacrificed pawn. Black really has nothing better than to grab the pawn. Black can't now exchange queens because then he couldn't take the pawn on e5 because his knight on d7 would be hanging. So if he wants the pawn, which I guess he does, he has to take immediately. And now we see the first fruits of white's pawn sacrifice. The knight comes to an excellent square on d5, and it's not easy for black to exchange it off. For example, if he plays knight f6, white just takes back, and after the exchange on d5, white gains a monster past d-pawn, well supported by the rook and the bishop on a5. So that's not really an option. Otherwise there's a nasty threat here. White actually threatens to play his bishop to c7 when the rook moves to win the black queen with knight takes bishop check and queen takes queen. So black has an immediate threat to counter, and with no easy way to get rid of this extremely strong knight on d5. Black played a very reasonable move under the circumstances. He played to simply block the diagonal and so counter the threat to win the black queen with a discovered attack. Now if white should take the pawn, black now does manage to exchange knights under rather more favourable circumstances, and white would only have a slight advantage. But Magnus isn't content with just getting a sacrificed pawn back. Now that black has once again opened a long diagonal, he can switch to a direct attack. Threatening mate in 1. Black doesn't have much choice but to block the diagonal. And now white plays his king h1 move. He's going to put his rook on g1, and with bishop, knight, rook and queen all pointing at the weak squares on f6 and g7, black is going to come under a very heavy attack on the king side. Black can't immediately drop his bishop back, pawn on f6 is hanging, so he moves his king out of the g-file pin. And now the bishop drops back to prevent the threatened mate. And I think this is the moment where you could say this is the second Magnus moment, because all the white pieces except really the rook on d1 are playing a part in the attack, but there's no obvious way to break through. And the move Magnus comes up here with now is rather special. He drops his fantastic knight back from d5 to e3. And there are really 3 reasons why this is a good move. First of all, the knight can now go to f5, which is in a way an even better square when it comes to prosecuting the kingside attack. And secondly, he blocks the pawn, so white can't get distracted by black suddenly pushing his e-pawn at some moment. And thirdly, and most importantly, he clears the d5 square for this rook to go to d5 and then h5. I said earlier that this rook on d1 is the only piece not playing a direct part in the attack. By switching it to h5, this rook can join the attack. As the saying goes, if you want to win with your attack, everybody has to join the party. By having all his pieces in the attack, he's going to create overwhelming threats on the king side. Black is in serious trouble now. I would say it's really a winning position for white, but of course he still has to continue accurately. Rook goes to h5. There's now all kinds of nice nasty threats on the h7 square. Black drops his queen back, in part to prevent white playing queen g6. Queen now switches to the h-file with the direct threat on h7, and black decided to play g6. White also wins if black plays h6. Knight f5 then threatens various nasty attacking sacrifices. Black plays his king to h7, and now white wins by playing rook h4 and then rook g4, and then black's position collapses because he's got no reasonable way to defend the pawn on h7. As I say, in the game black chose to push his g-pawn instead, and white dropped the rook back. Now there's another attacking possibility. The push of the g-pawn has made the advance f5 much stronger. Black wouldn't then be able to play g5 because white could just take it thanks to the pin along the long diagonal. Black desperately tries to shore up the weak pawn on f6, at last making use of his move rook b8, but it's a bit too late because the pawn comes into the attack as well. Black does his best to block the diagonal and supports the vulnerable g6 square, but now the knight switches back to d5, gaining a tempo by attacking the loose rook on b6 and also stepping up the pressure on f6. Black has to move his rook, and now Carlsen finished with a neat combination. He took, the pawn is pinned, so black has to take back with the knight, and now he smashes through. Black has to take, and now another sacrifice. And we can see that when black takes, white swaps queens and then picks off both the black rooks with his knight, one after the other. So this double sacrifice enables white to regain his sacrifice material with interest and clear exchange and pawn ahead. Of course, there's no point in black playing on. So I think this was quite an instructive game. First of all, the willingness to transform one advantage into another is a flexibility that not many players possess, but it's something that you can learn. And secondly, you shouldn't be wedded to the idea that if a piece is on a good square, you can't move it somewhere else. Firstly, to move it to an even better square, and secondly, to make way for another piece to become active. In this game, the knight dropped back from d5 because it enabled the final inactive piece, the rook on d1, to join the attack. And I would say that flexibility is one of the key marks of Carlsen's style in both these ways and in various others, which the author explains in the book. And whilst it's possible to learn a lot from studying the games of any world champion, I think this idea of flexibility and just playing the position, not being stuck with one particular idea, but being willing to abandon it when you see some better possibility, these are all things that will improve the chess of a great many players. Well, thanks very much for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed the game and, well, hopefully the book as well. Okay, join me for the next Gambit video. Thanks for watching.